Thank you, Alan, for that kind introduction, Dr. Strange. Thank you also, I don't know if I said it yet, now, if yesterday, thank you for having me here. It is an honor to be here. It's first time to campus, and it's always, I find it intriguing to sort of look at the Dutch American Reformed fingerprints at different institutions, having been a member of the CRC at Wheaton CRC, but also just long history in the OPC of Dutch Calvinist and American Presbyterian interactions. The OPC owes a great debt to the Dutch tradition. And I think studying outside your own tradition, if American Presbyterianism I can claim as my tradition, I grew up a mutt Baptist of some kind, but it's useful to keep an eye on other communions and other traditions to sort of keep yourself honest, as it were. So I'm grateful to be here, and I'm also grateful for the opportunity to think about Machen. I've actually spent a lot of time this year thinking about Machen with these lectures very much in the background of my mind. Whatever else I was writing, I wanted to make sure that I wasn't stealing too much from what I was preparing for this. And it was also a challenge to think about how to frame 3 lectures. But I'm grateful for that, because every time I go back and examine, read Machen, I come away really impressed and with new insights, partly because of my own experiences that are different from the ones that I had when I was first reading him as a graduate student, but still, thank you, long-winded, thank you. So today, Machen in the present. To begin, Machen was the original owning the libs conservative. For those unfamiliar with the phrase owning the libs, it's a political strategy that is intent on upsetting or mocking liberals, in one definition, which ignores the paradox of identifying with the ownership of other human beings at a time when most people recognize slavery is always and everywhere wrong. Conservatives try to own liberals when they emphasize and expand upon culture war issues that are divisive. This tactic is supposed to provoke a reaction in one's political opponents. A recent book, 69 Ways to Own the Libs, I imagine refusing to use the whole word liberal is a form of ownership. This book offers a smorgasbord of ways in which true American patriots can humiliate whiny libs on and off the internet. The author argues that lovers of the U.S. Constitution must never be complacent in humiliating, chastising, and crushing the armies of libs who may still have some sliver of hope for a progressive future. This sounds less like owning and more like junior high school. This author also may misunderstand one definition of politics, that is, the art of compromise, when he writes, the political process is nothing but antagonizing your opponents, even when it hurts you physically, psychologically, emotionally, or financially. So much for road repair or police. Since Machen argued in Christianity Liberalism that theological liberalism was not any recognizable form of Christianity, but an altogether different religion, he could well qualify as an owner of liberals. Seeing the way his argument played out in the PCUSA might also add support for this perception, since Machen certainly did provoke, in the parlance of our time, troll or gaslight his ecclesiastical foes. His argument was not equivocal. He wrote, modern liberalism may be criticized, 1, on the ground that it is unchristian, and 2, on the ground that it is unscientific. We shall concern ourselves here, he's writing, chiefly with the former line of criticism. We shall be interested in showing that despite the liberal use of traditional phraseology, modern liberalism not only is a different religion from Christianity, but belongs to a totally different class of religions. Liberalism in the modern church represents a return to an unchristian and sub-Christian form of the religious life, end of quote. At the same time, we need to remember, Machen was a classical liberal in the political sense, a firm believer in the American system of government, with its protection of citizens' rights from government overreach and the sovereignty of states within the federal system to carry out functions not enumerated in the Constitution. As Machen explained in the introduction, to his book. Government control of schooling, for instance, was an example of modern tyranny that disguised its power under the guise of progress. Quote, a public school system, if it means the providing of free education for those who desire it, is a noteworthy and beneficent achievement of modern times. But when once it becomes monopolistic, it is the most perfect instrument of tyranny which has yet been devised. Freedom of thought in the Middle Ages was combated by the Inquisition, but the modern method is far more effective. Place the lives of children in their formative years, despite the convictions of their parents, under the intimate control of experts appointed by the state, force them to attend schools where the higher aspirations of humanity are crushed out, and where the mind is filled with the materialism of the day, and it is difficult to see how even the remnants of liberty can subsist. Such a tyranny, supported as it is by a perverse technique used as the instrument in destroying human souls, is certainly far more dangerous than the crude tyrannies of the past, which, despite their weapons of fire and sword, permitted thought at least to be free. And if you can't tell from that quotation, it's really remarkable how much Machen still kind of is relevant to today's American politics. His understanding of liberalism, which was true for most American politicians until the civil rights movement of the 1960s, was in no way a rejection of dogmatic Christianity. As Machen explained often, the church, as a voluntary society, was free to set the terms for membership and officers, allowing such private associations to establish their own norms, even if those convictions were illiberal, was not a violation but an expression of civil liberty. Governments needed to avoid ideological dogmatism in allowing the free intercourse of movement of ideas and commerce, for instance. But in the case of citizens forming and maintaining their own institutions, as long as they were not breaking the laws, those exclusive organizations were as American as apple pie. And I think that's still okay to eat. When Machen called liberal Christianity unchristian, he may have sounded illiberal in another sense, engaging in a form of bad manners that, since that term was a form of opprobrium within the context of people who belong to churches. Machen tried to explain that because someone was not a Christian did not mean they were unworthy of respect, admiration, or even emulation. He wrote, "We do not mean unchristian at all as a term of opprobrium. Socrates was not a Christian, neither was Goethe. Yet we share to the full the respect with which their names are regarded. They tower immeasurably above the common run of men. If he that is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than they, he is certainly greater not by any inherent superiority, but by virtue of an undeserved privilege which ought to make him humble rather than contemptuous." And we heard a lot about pride and humility in that hymn that we sang. Goethe and Socrates sound like an odd way to own liberals. Machen, as we saw yesterday, was a classicist in background and a humanist in most senses of the term. His education steeped him in the great books of the West that were responsible for cultivating a liberal cast of mind. He was a member of the progressive Protestant elites who dominated American religious and educational institutions. So those two quotations, one denying that liberal Protestantism is Christian, the other showing admiration for humanistic liberalism, may not be sufficient to convince today's post-liberals, some of whom still carry a torch for Christendom, that Machen actually owned the liberals. Even so, paying attention to the way that Machen critiqued the errors of his time, both theological and political, could well be instructive for current attempts to respond to our cultural moment. In his day, the worlds of theology and politics were no more separate than they are today. In fact, the conceit that human beings can control society and even the natural world was just as much an axiom then as it is today, even as the expansion of government power, premised on that assumption, was as much a force then as it is today. This is one reason why, by the way, Aaron Renn's, and I'll say more about him in the second lecture today, Aaron Renn's historical chronology of the positive, neutral, and negative worlds of evangelicalism in the United States, with the negative world, as he argues, starting around 2014. This is why his scheme needs correction. Machen faced a world in which confessional Protestantism was as far removed from elite society as the Gospel Coalition or Christianity Today are today. Yet Machen did not merely teach classes and write academic monographs, but was a major voice in the 1920s debates about Christian America and the church's responsibility for constructing a just world. The way that Machen challenged the Protestant and political establishment was to question whether the church should have anything to do with government policy or programs. Some of Machen's critique obviously owed to his own political convictions, which ran directly contrary to American progressivism, with its plans to use government to improve the lives of all Americans. Machen objected that this was not the original understanding of American government, and that improve was a word very much in the eye of the beholder. Much more fundamental than a point about America's form of government was his contention that progressive Protestantism was not Protestant at all, and that the way to make that estimation was not on the basis of crime statistics or virtuous motives, but by the analytics of doctrinal science. Did Protestant progressives proclaim the gospel? Did they worship according to the word? And did they govern the church according to biblical patterns of ecclesiastical power? Machen spent most of his time in Christianity liberalism on the question of doctrine. But the importance of theology was simply another way of affirming the spirituality of the church, namely the notion that the church has spiritual means for accomplishing spiritual ends. In other words, explaining the Bible and teaching doctrine was at the heart of the church's spiritual mission. For those with eyes to see, Machen was owning liberals well before today's Christian nationalists or Roman Catholic integralists, but he was doing so without engaging in political activism or arguing the merits of law or policy or calling for a return to Christian America. He did so on the grounds of special revelation and the church's proper task. Today's generation of post-liberal Christian nationalists and alt-right Protestants could well take a page from Machen's playbook. George Marsden argued plausibly almost 40 years ago that the outbreak of fundamentalism in the early 1920s was substantially a response to the crisis of civilization that Western societies faced after what was a devastating world war. Here had been the most urbane and advanced countries in the world, the Western powers that prided themselves on leading the planet into a blessed new world order of peace and prosperity, slaughtering young men on each side of the battle lines for over 4 years. Thanks to the war, Protestants of a premillennialist dispensationalist bent had evidence to argue that postmillennialist dream of a world of increasing progress was a fantasy. Science, technology, industrialization, increasing rates of literacy, and Western influence among non-Western societies had not ushered in the millennium. The war had instead revealed that modern man's assumed superiority over the oftentimes cruel and brutal ways of pre-modern peoples was a lie. From one angle, this argument makes sense. It also shows that Machen and fundamentalists were not the only Americans disturbed by the Great War. Any number of prominent American authors turned pessimistic after the war thanks to the canyon between political idealism, that is, a war to make the world safe for democracy, and the enormities of trench warfare and the national self-interest of diplomats. In his novel, A Farewell to Arms, for instance, Ernest Hemingway tapped the skepticism that emerged as a counter to Wilsonian idealism when he wrote, "I was always embarrassed by the words sacred, glorious, and sacrifice. Abstract words such as glory, honor, courage, or hallow were obscene beside the concrete names of villages, the numbers of roads, the names of rivers, the numbers of regiments, and the dates." As important as the war was as a catalyst to the 1920s controversies, not to be missed was that for most American leaders in politics and the churches, the war only vindicated 50 years of optimism about making the world a better place. If the war had been fought on American territory, the reaction may very well have been different. But because it was largely a European affair, American officials could look at the war as a victory for the progress of Christian democracy over the backward impulses of European officials still constrained by the pre-modern errors of emperors, kings, and popes. Important to see about the progressive ethos is that it was a political program with a Protestant justification. As University of Pennsylvania historian Walter McDougall observes, the progressive era began in roughly the 1890s, and what characterized it was a sense that American institutions needed to be updated. The preferred word, as in the campaign of Pappy O'Daniels in the movie Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, was reform. Many officials and scholars agreed that American institutions couldn't cope with the modern problems thrown up by industrialization, urbanization, and immigration, including corporate trusts, labor strife, corruption, big city machines, public health, women's rights, and more. The preferred solution among the educated elites working in government, running businesses, and working in government agencies was scientific management by credentialed experts. According to the great historian of the New Deal, William Leuchtenberg, progressives believed in a national government directing the destinies of the nation at home and abroad. They had contempt for strict interpretations of the Constitution that prevented the federal government from acting against social evils or from extending the blessings of democracy to less favored lands. Progressives' enemies were particularism, states' rights, and limited government. McDougall cannot help but notice that descriptions of progressivism often used words with moral and religious significance, such as believed in, contempt, social evils, and real enemy. Instead of conceiving of progressivism as a secular movement inspired by the natural and social sciences, McDougall regards it as the academic and public policy arm of the mainline Protestant churches, or what his University of Pennsylvania colleague Bruce Kuklick called a more relaxed Protestantism of American higher education after the Civil War. At that time, higher criticism and Darwinism were challenging Protestant beliefs, especially about the Bible, and Ivy League universities, new ones like Chicago, Johns Hopkins, where Machen went, and Stanford, and land-grant universities devoted themselves to secular research on the German model. And the knowledge generated in science, engineering, sociology, political science, and economics easily persuaded politicians that cultural authority must pass from the clergy simply to the intelligentsia who knew how to manage God's universe with the benefit of mankind. Most of those intelligentsia, by the way, were Protestants, and many of them had grown up maybe thinking about becoming ministers, but then switched into these new academic disciplines. These newly minted PhDs were invariably sons and some daughters of the churches who had, like Daniel Coit Gilman, Johns Hopkins' first president, decided against the Congregationalist ministry in favor of doing more good in the world by studying natural science. Progressivism was clearly capable of making a bigger dent in society than the churches. Among the accomplishments of the political reformers were purging federal, state, and municipal governments of corruption and protecting the people through trust busting, the Pure Food and Drug Act, civil service reform, the income tax, direct election of senators, the Federal Reserve Bank, women's suffrage, and prohibition. These were not merely government policies, but also the fruit of pious hopes among proponents of the social gospel. If progressivism was political reform for some, for Protestants, it was applied Christianity. McDougall argues correctly that the social gospel dismissed the Augustinian distinction between the city of man and the city of God and stressed collective reform over personal salvation. It also made peace with evolution, put its faith in progress, and imagined good government could perfect society over time. According to Walter Rauschenbusch, the so-called father of the social gospel registers the fact that for the first time in history, the spirit of Christianity can form a working partnership with real social and psychological science. Instead of the universities and government officials leaving the churches behind, during the progressive era, the overlap among academy, state officials, and church leaders was extensive. Adding a helping or two of post-millennial eschatology, and you have the recipe for a righteous nation extending God's kingdom across the United States and around the world. McDougall did not notice that the denominational framework for ushering in the kingdom of God through progressive reform was the ecumenical movement. If Protestants were going to extend God's kingdom, they could not be divided in their operations. For instance, if Protestants were going to insist on the details of their theological, liturgical, or church polity convictions, they could not readily unite for social activism. Protestant ecumenism, therefore, was the flip side of the social gospel. The greatest evidence of this institutional and pious bond was the formation in 1908 of the Federal Council of Churches. Just prior to the creation of that body was the 1906 merger of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church and the Presbyterian Church in the USA. And 3 years before that church union was the 1903 revision of the Westminster Confession of Faith to soften the Calvinistic sharp elbows of the confession and make the PCUSA look more acceptable to Cumberland Presbyterians who a century earlier had removed those parts of the confession that violated their Arminian sensibilities. So here we see the pattern. The need for the church to respond to social crises, confessional revision to facilitate church union, followed by the formation of an ecumenical body that unites member denominations behind political and social reform. If anyone wondered about the social reform character of the Federal Council, all they needed to do was look at the first major piece of business conducted by in 1908 by the newly minted delegates to Philadelphia. The council adopted a social creed for the churches, which included vague pieces of Progressive Party platform. Among them were these, and I'm quoting, "For the principle of conciliation and arbitration in industrial dissensions, for the protection of the worker from dangerous machinery, occupational disease, injuries, and mortality, for the abolition of child labor, for the gradual, responsible, and reasonable reduction of the hours of labor to the lowest practical point, and for that degree of leisure for all which is a condition of the highest human life, for suitable provision for the old age of workers and for those incapacitated by injury, for the abatement of poverty." It's about 15 points in all. The council did not supply a "thus saith the Lord" for these policy recommendations. Neither did they show the theological or exegetical work that allowed American Protestants in good conscience to confess this creed, and it was billed as a creed. Progressive Protestantism was also behind the construction of a new American foreign policy. Because liberal Protestants confused the cross with the flag, as McDougall argues, Senator Albert Beveridge from Indiana could say, "We cannot retreat from any soil where Providence has unfurled our banner, for liberty and civilization are God's promises fulfilled, and the flag must henceforth be the symbol and sign to all mankind." He had help from William Guthrie, a University of Chicago professor, who promoted a religion of old glory and an evolutional view of good and evil, and who prophesied the stars and stripes would become the flag of a federation of nations and the ideal of the kingdom of heaven on earth. For anyone who noticed the origin of Machen's book, Christianity and Liberalism, it was the culmination of a 3-year effort to defeat a plan presented at the General Assembly of 1920 by the president of Princeton Seminary, no less, to form a single Protestant church in the United States. As a commissioner to that assembly, which met in Philadelphia, Machen not only heard the arguments for church union, but he also met Presbyterian conservatives, many of whom were in churches and presbyteries in southeastern Pennsylvania. A talk that Machen gave to the elders of the Presbytery of Chester became an article in the Princeton Theological Review, which became the launching pad for the book Christianity and Liberalism. Machen's book was a William F. Buckley Jr. moment. He was standing up to progress and yelling, "Stop." The book, probably a lot of people don't get that reference to Buckley, but some of the older people do. The book was supposed to be a large speed bump on the ramp, taking the mainline churches onto the highway of progressive religion and politics. Before looking at how Machen owned the progressives, we should also remember that Protestant progressivism did not peter out in the 1920s, but was a juggernaut that extended into the 30s and moved from the American churches to the mission field, where plans for Protestant unity turned into efforts by Christians to unite with other religions as part of the effort to modernize non-Western societies. As Michael Doran, who was some official in the Bush administration, as he argued at First Things in a remarkably insightful article on the theological framework of U.S. foreign policy, Protestant ecumenism and the social gospel had an international equivalent, namely missionary cosmopolitanism. Doran writes that American progressives stressed universal human brotherhood as a realistic outcome of goodwill. Doran identifies this belief as fundamental to John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s understanding of the church and the world. Rockefeller, who was a neighbor of Machen at Seal Harbor, Maine, where both families vacationed, and where Machen preached a couple of times at Rockefeller's invitation at the local Union Church, that Rockefeller was responsible for the study of Protestant foreign missions that provoked the last ecclesiastical contest of Machen's career and life. The report, Rethinking Missions, commissioned in 1930 and published in 1932, is also known as the Hocking Report, thanks to the name of its author, William Ernest Hocking, a tenured professor of philosophy at Harvard University. These sorts of networks, the oil money of Rockefeller, the central offices of mainline Protestant denominations, and the faculty of Ivy League universities gives a sense of the Protestant establishment's institutional breadth. As Doran summarized the report, Rethinking Missions called on missionaries to stop evangelism. The reason is that Jesus is not the sole path to knowledge of God. For the commissioners and the report's sponsor, Christianity remained the fullest expression of truth, but the rest of the world's other religions also captured pieces of truth. The new task of missions, consequently, was to identify the Christ-like elements in other religions and to cultivate them with an eye to forging alliances across religious divides. Just as the social gospelers insisted that faith without works is dead, so modern missionaries needed to embrace deeds over creeds. This meant that missions agencies needed to provide education, healthcare, assistance to the poor, while allowing indigenous peoples to remain loyal to their native faiths. For Doran, this was a foreign mission strategy that applied the social gospel and Protestant ecumenism to the rest of the world. At the same time, just as Presbyterians needed to abandon their allegiance to distinct Reformed convictions and practices in order to join the great chorus of ecumenical Protestantism, so American missionaries needed to drop their theological triumphalism. The new plan for missions, actually had been growing since the 1890s, was to strengthen ties between Christians and non-Christian religions in Asia for the sake of improved living conditions and social harmony. Protestant ecumenism had blossomed into a world's parliament of religions, and the social gospel had become the humanitarian arm of that parliament. As much as this liberal and internationalist vision seemed to diminish Protestant superiority and American power, it was actually a path toward a global system that put American Protestants at the center of managing a world of international peace and goodwill. Little old Baptists in southwest Iowa or northwest Indiana were now as important to the rest of the world as were Presbyterians on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Doran did not notice that Presbyterians were on the ground floor of this Protestant empire. Way back in 1869, when the Old School and New School Presbyterian communions reunited after 30 years of separation, the rationale for union envisioned, perhaps in a murky way, what played out over the next 6 decades. Part of the rationale for the reunion was social. The United States had undergone many changes in 30 years, which meant that the church also needed to adjust. The nation's population and territory had almost doubled. Immigration was changing the composition of the nation's people. Slaves had been emancipated, and adding to the challenges were the increase of anti-Christian forces, and these were the anti-Christian forces in 1869. Romanism, ecclesiasticism, rationalism, infidelity, materialism, and paganism itself. The logic which carried over into the progressive era was that only through united institutions could the church respond effectively to national crises. But what about the doctrinal controversy that had prompted the split in 1837 between the Old and New School Presbyterians? The plan for union relegated those theological questions to the past, not simply to Jacksonian America, but to the olden days of the Reformation. Here's how the plan for union put it. Quote, many of the ecclesiastical organizations of Protestant Europe had their origins in remote controversies connected with the Reformation. That was a time for the assertion of truth rather than for the expression of love. Nothing is so long-lived and inveterate as ancestral memories and prejudices. End of quote. The reformers for the plan of union authors were fine to insist on doctrine, but the demands of contemporary America transcended that narrow outlook. And I read more from that plan. Before the world, we are now engaged as a nation in solving the problem of whether it is possible for all the incongruous and antagonistic nationalities thrown upon our shores, exerting their mutual attraction and repulsion, to become fixed in one new American sentiment. If the several branches of the Presbyterian Church in this country, representing to a great degree ancestral differences, should become cordially united, it must have not only a direct effect upon the question of our national unity, but, reacting by the force of a successful example on the old world, must render aid in that direction to all who are striving to reconsider and readjust those combinations which had their origin either in the faults or necessities of a remote past. Notice Reformation regarded as faults or necessities of that time. A united Presbyterian Church, then, was not simply what the United States needed. A united Presbyterian Church might also help Europe avoid conflict and competition and inaugurate the European Union. Aside from the unfortunate development that it took 125 years for Europeans to heed the American Presbyterian forecast, the reunion of the old and new school churches formulated the basic rationale for Protestant ecumenism and the social gospel era that still beats faintly in the institutions that the mainline Protestants oversee. This 50-year buildup of church cooperation and social justice activity was the backdrop for Machen's book. It was a direct response to that chapter in American Protestant church history. He challenged Protestant progressivism on two fronts. The first and most obvious was doctrine. If Protestants were going to abandon doctrine as the way to define Christianity, worse, if they were going to abandon the doctrines that attached directly to the person and work of Christ, then they were going to leave Christianity behind for an altogether different religion. In his chapter on the church, Machen drew on his family's familiarity with law to instruct fellow Protestants that jettisoning doctrine ran contrary to the confessional and constitutional status of the different Protestant denominations. Even if a creedal church were an undesirable thing, Machen supposed, it would still remain true that, as a matter of fact, many, indeed if in spirit really all evangelical churches are creedal churches, and that if a man does accept their creed, he has no right to a place in their teaching ministry. The second front on which Machen confronted progressive Protestantism was the nature on the ministry of the church. He never used the phrase spirituality of the church, but it was never far from his outlook, whether because he grew up in the Southern Presbyterian Church or because of his familiarity with the Westminster Confession, which itself provides warrant for the doctrine when it asserts in chapter 31, synods and councils are to handle or conclude nothing but that which is ecclesiastical, and are not to intermeddle with civil affairs which concern the commonwealth unless by way of humble petition in cases extraordinary. To discern Machen's appeal to the spirituality of the church may require a little extra work, if only because the book begins with an assessment of American society and politics in a way does not sound all that spiritual. Although Christianity liberalism's explicit purpose was to defend Christian doctrine, its subtext was a complaint against the increasing standardization and centralization of American life thanks to progressive Protestantism. What may have surprised readers then and now was Machen's lament took the side not of WASP elites, but of immigrants and cultural outsiders, which may be one reason why Machen liked Dutch American Reformed and German Lutherans so much. In the book's introduction, when he explained why readers outside the churches might find the fundamentalist controversy important, Machen devoted several pages to state laws that banned the study of foreign languages in public schools before the 8th grade, or that required students to attend public instead of parochial or private schools. These laws were signs of a drab utilitarianism in which all higher aspirations are lost. Later in the book, when arguing against a utilitarian view of religion with the church as an agent of civic improvement, Machen again invoked the experience of immigrants. To illustrate the pragmatic approach to Christianity, Machen adopted the voice of the progressive do-gooder. There is the problem of the immigrants. Great populations have found a place in our country. They do not speak our language or know our customs. This problem of assimilation led reformers to use religion in a peculiar way. Machen quotes them again. We are inclined to proceed against the immigrants now with a Bible in one hand and a club in the other, offering them the blessings of liberty. This was an odd way, Machen observed, to implement Christian Americanization. Behind these reforms, Machen argued, was a materialistic paternalism that discouraged all spiritual adventure. He feared this outlook was turning America into one huge Main Street in which democracy had become little more than reducing all people to the proportions of the narrowest and least gifted of the citizens. Although modernization had yielded great improvements in material conditions, those advances had come at the expense of spiritual decline. This was Machen's one shot at enlisting cultural traditionalists on the side of conservative Christianity. Perhaps people who read and studied the ancients or the great works of Western literature could sympathize with those Protestants like Machen who wanted to defend and maintain the historic Christian teachings on sin and grace. If Plato's dialogues or Cicero's moral reflections were part of Western civilization's spiritual adventure, then Machen hoped cultural conservatives might find room for the Apostle Paul's epistles or King David's Psalms. However plausible that analogy, the politics that framed the book pushed back on what Walter Lippmann called the dominant dogma of the age, the idea that government could solve most human problems. Contrary to that ambitious view of government, Machen insisted that only the church, in its spiritual capacity, through the ministry of word and sacrament, had the remedy for humankind's alienation from God and adversarial social relations. He concluded the book by stressing the church's spiritual character. Weary with the conflicts of the world, Machen wrote, one goes into church to see refreshment for the soul. Too often, the world-weary Christian heard sermons with human opinions about the social problems of the hour or easy solutions of the vast problem of sin. Machen pleaded for a space where two or three can gather in Jesus' name to forget for the moment all those things that divide nation from nation, race from race, to forget the passions of war, to forget the puzzling problems of industrial strife, to unite in overflowing gratitude at the foot of the cross. If such a place existed, he concluded, then that is the house of God, the gate of heaven. Machen's point was a simple one, but with profound consequences, thanks to a 50-year movement within progressive Protestantism. His point was that the church should stay in its lane. Its calling was and remains spiritual. Its end was to proclaim the coming of a kingdom that would only arrive completely with the return of Christ. That mission so far transcended the worthwhile but temporal affairs of government policy and legislation that to treat politics as if regulatory agencies or executive decisions were as important as the work of the church was to misread the gospel completely. In effect, the troubling element of liberal Protestantism, as Machen showed, was not merely that modernists equivocated on basic Christian doctrine. What was more devastating was that Protestant liberals made the affairs of the temporal world a higher priority than the spiritual realities of the age to come. That objection was particularly noticeable in Machen's conclusion to the book. These are the questions that began the final pages of the book, the place where he responded to the editor who must have asked, but what are we supposed to do? Give us some advice. Machen wrote, Christianity is being attacked from within by a movement which is anti-Christian to the core. What is the duty of Christian men at such a time? What is the duty in particular of Christian officers in the church? Machen answered by saying that first, officers should provide encouragement to those engaged in intellectual and spiritual struggle. Second, that they should revisit qualifications for the ministry. Third, that they should apply those standards in the actual selection of ministers. And fourth, most important, church officers should promote education within the church, especially theological education. In the meantime, however, Machen knew he was in for a long war. Whether he understood how deep the historical roots of progressive Protestantism were, he did apprehend that it was not going to go away anytime soon. In fact, Machen endured in the conflict for the remainder of his life, another 13 years. Perhaps because the battle was going to take so long, Machen wanted comfort along the way, akin to what he provided to soldiers in France during World War I when he sold hot chocolate and cigarettes as a YMCA secretary. He desired the church to be truly spiritual because he needed the soul food of word and sacrament. And he writes this, "Weary with the conflicts of the world, one goes into church to seek refreshment for the soul. And what does one find? Alas, too often one finds only the turmoil of the world. The preacher comes forward not out of secret place of meditation and power, not with the authority of God's word permeating his message, not with human wisdom pushed far into the background by the glory of the cross, but with human opinions about the social problems of the hour or easy solutions to the vast problem of sin. Such is the sermon. And then perhaps the service is closed by one of those hymns breathing out the angry passions of 1861, which are to be found in the back parts of the hymnal. Thus the warfare of the world has entered even into the house of God, and sad indeed is the heart of the man who has come seeking peace." And from there followed Machen's plaintive cry for the church to be the church. Is there no refuge from strife? Is there no place of refreshing where a man can prepare for the battle of life? Is there no place where two or three can gather in Jesus' name to forget for the moment all the things that divide nation from nation and race from race, to forget human pride, to forget the passions of war, to forget the puzzling problems of industrial strife, and to unite in overflowing gratitude at the foot of the cross? If there be such a place, then that is the house of God and the gate of heaven. I understand I repeated that, but it's still worth hearing twice. 10 years later, during the height of the controversy over foreign missions, when people were beginning to see the effects of progressive Protestantism for the church's international witness, Machen had a chance to re-examine his attachment to the spirituality of the church. The occasion was a meeting of political and social scientists in which conference organizers arranged a panel of clergy, Christian and Jewish, to comment on the responsibility of the church in what they called the New Age. What was new about 1933 was the Great Depression, major economic hardship, and the need for government to do something. In his essay, Machen did not flinch. He remained firm about the work of the church. Its ministry was one that transcended time, place, and circumstances because salvation did not depend on politics, economics, education, agriculture, military, art, or science. He wrote, or said both, "You cannot expect from a true church any official pronouncements upon the political or social questions of the day, and you cannot expect cooperation with the state in anything involving the use of force. Important are the functions of the police and members of the church, either individually or in such special associations as they may choose to form, should aid the police in every lawful way in the exercise of those functions. But the function of the church in its corporate capacity is of an entirely different kind. Its weapons against evil are spiritual, not carnal. And by becoming a political lobby through the advocacy of political measures, whether good or bad, the church is turning aside from its proper mission, which is to bring to bear upon human hearts the solemn and imperious, yet also sweet and gracious appeal of the gospel of Christ." And then he went on, "The responsibility of the church in the new age is the same as its responsibility in every age. It is to testify that the world is lost in sin, that the span of human life, nay, all the length of human history, is an infinitesimal island in the awful depths of eternity, that there is a mysterious, holy, living God, creator of all, upholder of all, infinitely beyond all, that he has revealed himself to us in his word and offered us communion with himself through Jesus Christ the Lord, that there is no other salvation for individuals or for nations save this, but this salvation is full and free, and that whosoever possesses it has for himself and for all others to whom he may be the instrument of bringing it, a treasure compared with which all the kingdoms of the earth, nay, all the wonders of the starry heavens, are as the dust of the street. An unpopular message it is, an impractical message we are told, but it is the message of the Christian church. Neglect it, and you will have destruction. Heed it, and you will have life. Again, remember, Machen was giving this speech paper to a body of social, political scientists, economists, etc. That's all well and good, someone might reply, but in the end, didn't Machen lose? Could anyone possibly think that he owned the liberals by taking a whole 5,000 members from the PCUSA into the OPC? The person asking might well be chuckling. That mirth indicates how difficult the argument that Machen owned the liberals is. Maybe the best you can say is that he softened up polite Protestant opinion for the likes of Reinhold Niebuhr, the mention of whose name prompted Barack Obama to say when president, "I love him." He's one of my favorite philosophers. To be sure, neo-orthodoxy showed that liberalism could not be sustained. In that sense, Machen was correct, but only to a point. His argument was not merely about the viability of historic Christianity. Machen wanted a church free from liberalism, and part of what he accomplished was a PCUSA without Princeton's old school Presbyterianism, and also free from Machen himself. It was the modernist strategy that was one of viability. They did what they did to preserve the church, to make it possible for the church to continue to lead American society, especially to win over Christianity's cultural despisers. And on that point, you could say that Machen did win. He saw that their apologetic was doomed to fail, that it would not finally grip the intellectual aspirations of America's elites. For proof of that, we need only look to H.L. Mencken's assessment of the dispute. The Baltimore journalist was by no means the sole arbiter of American ideas and letters, but his standing as one of the most prominent writers of the time, whose perspective historians still use to take the temperature of the era, makes his obituary of Machen an important data point in assessing Machen's ownership of the liberals. This is a long quotation I'm going to read, but it's valuable for both its content and style. Mencken wrote, about 2 weeks after Machen's death, "It is my belief, as a friendly neutral in all such high and ghostly matters, that the body of doctrine known as modernism is completely incompatible, not only with anything rationally describable as Christianity, but also with anything deserving to pass as religion in general. Religion, if it is to retain any genuine significance, can never be reduced to a series of sweet attitudes possible to anyone not actually in jail for felony. It is, on the contrary, a corpus of powerful and profound convictions, many of them not open to logical analysis. Its inherent improbabilities are not sources of weakness to it, but of strength. It is potent in a man in proportion as he is willing to reject all other overt evidences and accept its fundamental postulates, however unprovable they may be by secular means, as massive and incontrovertible facts. These postulates, at least in the Western world, have been challenged in recent years on many grounds, and in consequence there has been a considerable decline in religious belief. There was a time 2 or 3 centuries ago when the overwhelming majority of educated men were believers, but that is apparently true no longer. Indeed, it is my impression that at least 2/3 of them are now frank skeptics. But it is one thing to reject religion altogether, and quite another to save it by pumping out of it all its essential substance, leaving it in the equivocal position of a sort of pseudoscience comparable to graphology, education, or osteopathy. Notice he put education as one of these questionable sciences. That, it seems to me, is what the modernists have done, no doubt with the best intentions in the world. They have tried to get rid of all the logical difficulties of religion and yet preserve a generally pious cast of mind. It is a vain enterprise. What they have left once they have achieved their imprudent scavenging is hardly more than a row of hollow platitudes, as empty as of psychological force and effect as so many nursery rhymes. They may be good people, and they may even be contented and happy, but they are no more religious than Dr. Einstein. Religion is something else again, in Heinrich Ibsen's phrase, something far more deep down diving and mud upbringing. Dr. Machen tried to impress that obvious fact upon his fellow adherents of the Geneva Mohammed. He failed, but he was undoubtedly right. Taking a victory lap, end of Mencken there, taking a victory lap for Machen under the cover of Mencken's positive estimate does not prove that Machen defeated his adversaries. Mencken is better remembered than Machen, but the journalist's reputation these days tests higher for toxicity than even Machen's brand of conservative Presbyterianism. Even so, in the annals of American history or church history, you take your wins where you find them. Here it is worth considering that Mencken's assessment of Machen does prove that battles over the flagrant provocations of Harry Emerson Fosdick, the special pleading of the Auburn Affirmation, the reorganization of Princeton Seminary, and the one-world idealism of the Hocking Report were not trivial matters. Both Mencken and Machen recognized that progressive Protestantism was ruinous for the health of Protestantism and for the health of American society. Some historians may argue that liberal Protestants were on the winning side because they helped make the United States less religious and more open to people who were not Protestant, even to the point that post-Protestantism is preferable to Protestantism. But before liberals take their own victory lap for turning the academy, mainstream journalism, pop culture, and the Democratic Party into their own image of whatever you do, don't let the fundamentalists win, they need to hear Ross Douthat's withering remark, quote, liberal Protestantism without the Protestantism tends to gradually shed the liberalism as well, transforming into an illiberal cult of victimologies that burns heretics with vigor. In other words, Machen may very well have owned the libs because he showed that liberal Protestants were digging their own graves. And I will stop there.